Roland Barthes, Writing Degree Zero. Part 1. What is writing? We know that language is a corpus of prescriptions and habits common to all the writers of a period, which means that a language is a kind of natural ambience, wholly pervading the writer's expression, yet without endowing it with form or content. It is, as it were, an abstract circle of truths, outside of which alone the solid residue of an individual logos begins to settle. It enfolds the whole of literary creation, much as the earth, the sky, and the line where they meet outline a familiar habitat for mankind. It is not so much a stock of materials, but a horizon, which implies both a boundary and a perspective. In short, it is the comforting area of an ordered space. The writer literally takes nothing from it. A language is for him rather a frontier, to overstep which alone might lead to the linguistically supernatural. It is a field of action, the definition of and hope for a possibility. It is not the locus of a social commitment, but merely a reflex response involving no choice, the undivided property of men, not of writers. It remains outside the ritual of letters. It is a social object by definition, not by option. No one can, without formalities, pretend to insert his freedom as a writer into the resistant medium of language, because, behind the latter, the whole of history stands unified and complete in the manner of a natural order. Hence, for the writer, a language is nothing but a human horizon, which provides a distant setting of familiarity, the value of which, incidentally, is entirely negative. To say that Camus and Gounod speak the same language is merely to presume, by a differential operation, all languages, archaic and futuristic, that they do not use. Suspended between forms, either disused or as yet unknown, the writer's language is not so much a fun to be drawn on as an extreme limit. It is the geometrical locus of all that he could not say without, like Orpheus looking back, losing the stable meaning of his enterprise and his essential gesture as a social being. A language is therefore on the hither side of literature. Style is almost beyond it. Imagery, delivery, vocabulary spring from the body and the past of the writer, and gradually become the very reflexes of his art. Thus, under the name of style, a self-sufficient language is evolved, which has its roots only in the depths of the author's personal and secret mythology, that subnature of expression where the first cohesion of words and things takes place, where, once and for all, the great verbal themes of his existence come to be installed. Whatever its sophistication, style has always something crude about it. It is a form with no clear destination, the product of a thrust, not an intention, and, as it were, a vertical and lonely dimension of thought. Its frame of reference is biological or biographical, not historical. It is the writer's thing, his glory and his prison. It is his solitude. Indifferent to society and transparent to it, style is a close personal process. It is in no way the product of a choice or a reflection on literature. It is the private portion of the ritual. It rises up from the writer's myth-laden depths and unfolds beyond his area of control. It is the decorative voice of hidden, secret flesh. It works as does necessity, as if, in this kind of floral growth, style were no more than the outcome of a blind and stubborn metamorphosis, starting from a sub-language elaborated where flesh and external reality come together. Style is, properly speaking, a germinative phenomenon, the transmutation of a humor. Hence, stylistic overtones are distributed in depth. Whereas speech has a horizontal structure, its secrets are on a level with the words in which they are couched, and what it conceals is revealed by the varied duration of its flow. In speech, everything is held forth, meant for immediate consumption, and words, silences, and their common mobility are launched towards a meaning superseded. It is a transfer leaving no trace and brooking no delay. Style, on the other hand, has only a vertical dimension. It plunges into the closed recollection of the person and achieves its opacity from a certain experience of matter. Style is never anything but metaphor, that is, equivalence of the author's literary intention and carnal structure. It must be remembered that structure is the residual deposit of duration. So that style is always a secret, but the occult aspect of its implications does not arise from the mobile and ever-provisional nature of language. Its secret is recollection locked within the body of the writer. The elusive virtue of style is not a matter of speed as in speech, where what is unsaid nevertheless remains an entering of language, but a matter of density, for what stands firmly and deeply beneath style, brought together harshly or tenderly in its figures of speech, are fragments of a reality entirely alien to language. The miracle of this transmutation makes style a kind of supra-literary operation which carries men to the threshold of power and magic. By reason of its biological origin, style resides outside art, that is, outside the pact which binds the writer to society. Authors may therefore be imagined who prefer the security of art to the loneliness of style. The very type of an author without a style is Guide, whose craftsman-like approach exploits the pleasures the moderns derive from a certain classical ethos, just as Saint-Saëns has composed in Bach's idiom or Poulenc in Schubert's. In contrast, modern poetry, such as Hugo's, Rimbaud's, or Chartres, is saturated with style and is art only by virtue of an intention to be poetry. It is the authority of style, that is, the entirely free relationship between language and its fleshy double, which places the writer above history as the freshness of innocence. A language is therefore a horizon, and style a vertical dimension, which together map out for the writer a nature, since he does not choose either. The language functions negatively, as the initial limit of the possible. Style is a necessity, which binds the writer's humor to his form of expression. In the former, he finds a familiar history, in the latter, a familiar personal past. In both cases, he deals with the nature, that is, a familiar repertory of gestures, a gestuary, as it were, in which the energy expended is purely operative, serving here to enumerate, there to transform, but never to appraise or signify a choice. Now, every form is also a value, which is why there is room between a language and a style for another form or reality, writing. Within any literary form, there is a general choice of tone, of ethos, if you like, and this is precisely where the writer shows himself clearly as an individual, because this is where he commits himself. A language and a style are data prior to all problematics of language. They are the natural product of time and of the person as a biological entity. But the formal identity of the writer is truly established only outside the permanence of grammatical norms and stylistic constants, where the written continuum, first collected and enclosed within a perfectly innocent linguistic nature, at last becomes a total sign, the choice of a human attitude, the affirmation of a certain good. It thus commits the writer to manifest and communicate a state of happiness or malaise, and links the form of his utterance, which is at once normal and singular, to the vast history of the others. A language and a style are blind forces. A mode of writing is an act of historical solidarity. A language and a style are objects. A mode of writing is a function. It is the relationship between creation and society, the literary language transformed by its social finality, form considered as human intention and thus linked to the great crisis of history. Mérimée and Fénelon, for instance, are separated by linguistic phenomena and contingent features of style. Yet, they make use of a language charged with the same intentionality. Their ideas of form and content share a common framework. They accept the same type of conventions. The same technical reflexes work through both of them. Although separated by a century and a half, they use exactly the same instrument in the same way. An instrument perhaps a little changed in outward appearance, but not at all in the place and manner of its employment. In short, they have the same mode of writing. In contrast, writers who are almost contemporaries, Mérimée and Lautréamont, Mallarmé and Céline, Gide and Queneau, Claudel and Camus, who have shared or who share our language at the same stage of its historical development, use utterly different modes of writing. Everything separates them: tone, delivery, purpose, ethos, and naturalness of expression. The conclusion is that to live at the same time and share the same language is a small matter compared with modes of writing so dissimilar and so sharply defined by their very dissimilarity. These modes of writing, though different, are comparable because they owe their existence to one identical process, namely the writer's consideration of the social use which he has chosen for his form, and his commitment to this choice. Placed at the center of the problematics of literature, which cannot exist prior to it, writing is thus essentially the morality of form, the choice of that social area within which the writer elects to situate the nature of his language. But this social area is by no means that of an actual consumption. It is not a question for the writer of choosing the social group for which he is to write. Well, he knows that save for the possibility of a revolution, it can only be for the selfsame society. His choice is a matter of conscience, not of efficacy. His writing is a way of conceiving literature, not of extending its limits. Or better still, it is because the writer cannot modify in any way the objective data which govern the consumption of literature that he voluntarily places the need for a free language at the sources of this language and not in its eventual consumption. These purely historical data are beyond his control, even if he is aware of them. So that writing is an ambiguous reality. On the one hand, it unquestionably arises from a confrontation with the writer with the society of his time. On the other, from this social finality, it refers the writer back, by a sort of tragic reversal, to the sources, that is to say, the instruments of creation. Failing the power to supply him with a freely consumed language, history suggests to him the demand for one freely produced. Thus, the choice of, and afterwards the responsibility for, a mode of writing pointing to the presence of freedom. But this freedom has not the same limits at different moments of history. It is not granted to the writer to choose his mode of writing from a kind of non-temporal store of literary forms. It is under the pressure of history and tradition that the possible modes of writing for a given writer are established. There is a history of writing. But this history is dual. At the very moment when general history proposes or imposes new problematics of the literary language, writing still remains full of the recollection of previous usage, for language is never innocent. Words have a second-order memory which mysteriously persists in the midst of new meanings. Writing is precisely this compromise between freedom and remembrance. It is this freedom which remembers and is free only in the gesture of choice, but is no longer so within duration. True, I can today select such and such mode of writing, and in so doing assert my freedom, aspire to the freshness of novelty or to a tradition. But it is impossible to develop it within duration without gradually becoming a prisoner of someone else's words and even of my own. A stubborn outer image which comes from all the previous modes of writing and even from the past of my own, drowns the sound of my present words. Every written trace precipitates like a chemical element, at first transparent, innocent, and neutral, in which mere duration gradually reveals an entire past in suspension, an increasingly dense cryptography. Writing as freedom is therefore a mere moment. But this moment is one of the most explicit in history, since history is always and above all a choice and the limits of this choice. It is because writing derives from a meaningful gesture of the writer that it reaches the deeper layers of history, much more palpably than does any other cross-section of literature. The unity of classical writing, which remained uniform for centuries, the plurality of its modes in modern times, increased in the last 100 years until it came near to questioning the very fact of literature. This kind of disintegration of French writing does indeed correspond to a great crisis in general history, which is noticeable in literary history proper, only much more confusedly. What separates the thought of a Balzac from that of a Flaubert is a variation within the same school. What contrasts their modes of writing is an essential break, at the precise moment when a new economic structure is joined on to an older one, thereby bringing about decisive changes in mentality and consciousness.